I was 16 the night my dad told me to get out. It was mid-October, the air was sharp and cold, and the argument started over something so small I can't even remember it anymore. Maybe I forgot to take out the trash, or maybe I said something sarcastic at the wrong time. But it spiraled, like it always did. My father's face turned red, his voice thundered, and my mom stood in the corner, silent, staring down at her shoes. "Get out, Ryan," my dad said, pointing to the door. I hesitated, looking at my mom, hoping for something. Some sign that this wasn't real, that someone would stop him. But she wouldn't look at me. So, I went upstairs, shoved whatever clothes I could grab into my backpack, and walked out the front door. The porch light flicked off behind me, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be truly alone. I had an old Chevy Astro van. It was faded blue, with a cracked windshield and seats that smelled faintly of mildew. It wasn't much, but it started when I turned the key, and in that moment, it was the only thing I had. I parked behind a Walmart that night, wrapping myself in a hoodie, and stared at the ceiling of the van. I kept waiting for my phone to buzz, for someone to call me back, for the front door to swing open, and for them to tell me to come home. But no one did. The first few weeks were the hardest. I had about $40 in cash, and whatever loose change was rolling around the bottom of my van. I bought cheap fast food, rationing it out to make it last as long as possible. Gas became more valuable than food. If I couldn't move my van, I couldn't sleep safely. I learned pretty quickly that parking lots behind big stores like Walmart and Target were safer than most places. Security guards didn't care as long as you didn't make a mess, and there were usually other cars parked overnight. People like me, trying to disappear. The van became my whole world. The back row of seats folded down into something resembling a bed, though the metal bars underneath dug into my back, no matter how many blankets I piled on top. I hung an old towel across the rear windows for privacy. My backpack stayed tucked under the passenger seat, where I could grab it quickly if I ever had to leave in a hurry. My days were spent looking for work. I didn't have a high school diploma, and most places wouldn't even look at me. I finally got hired at a greasy little diner washing dishes under the table for cash. The manager, a woman named Donna with nicotine-stained fingers and tired eyes, didn't ask questions when I told her I didn't have an address. "Show up on time, don't steal, and don't piss off the cooks," she said. I worked 14-hour shifts, scrubbing plates until my knuckles bled from the hot water and industrial soap. When the diner closed at 2 a.m., I'd drive back to my usual parking spot, lock my doors, and sleep until the sun came up and the van got too hot to bear. Winter was the worst. There were nights I couldn't feel my fingers or toes. I'd sit in the driver's seat, knees pulled to my chest, trying to breathe warmth into my cupped hands. I layered on every piece of clothing I owned, but it was never enough. Sometimes, I'd drive just to let the heater run for a few minutes, but gas was expensive, and I couldn't afford to waste it. I showered at the YMCA after saving up for a cheap monthly membership. I learned to wash my clothes in bathroom sinks and dry them under hand dryers. I learned which gas stations didn't care if you lingered too long, charging your phone at an outlet near the soda machines. Over time, I became invisible. People don't notice you when you're quiet, when you keep your head down, when you avoid eye contact. You become just another shadow in the corner of their day. But invisibility is a double-edged sword. There were nights when someone would knock on my van window, usually drunk guys looking for trouble. Once, someone tried to open my passenger door while I was asleep. I kept a tire iron under my seat after that. I made friends with other people who lived like me, transient souls drifting from parking lot to parking lot. There was an older guy named Charlie who lived in a rusty van. He'd been on the streets for almost 10 years. He taught me how to keep condensation from building up on the inside of my windows so I wouldn't freeze at night. But most people came and went. They'd disappear one day, and I'd never see them again. By the time I turned 18, I'd managed to save a little money. Not much, but enough to rent a tiny room in the back of a mechanic shop. The walls were thin, and the place always smelled like oil and burnt rubber, but it was warm, and I could lock the door behind me. I picked up extra shifts at a gas station down the road. Between the diner and the gas station, I was working almost 70 hours a week. My body ached, my eyes burned from exhaustion, but I was surviving. It took me almost 3 years to save enough for a down payment on a foreclosure. The house was tiny, barely more than a glorified shed, and the roof leaked when it rained. But the day I signed the papers and got the keys, I sat in the empty living room and cried. It was mine. No one could kick me out. No one could slam a door in my face. The next year was spent fixing it up. I worked during the day and patched drywall, painted walls, and replaced busted floorboards at night. I watched hours of YouTube tutorials on plumbing and electrical work. Slowly but surely, the house became livable. I didn't have much furniture, just a thrifted couch, a mattress on the floor, and a wobbly dining table, but it was enough. It was peaceful. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, there was a knock on my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. My mom stood there, clutching her purse in front of her like it was a shield. My dad stood slightly behind her, arms crossed and face tight with some emotion I couldn't quite read. And behind them, peeking out from under his hoodie, was Lucas, my little brother. Except he wasn't so little anymore. He was 16, the same age I was when they kicked me out. Ryan, my mom said softly, "Can we come in?" I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed to slam the door in their faces. But then I caught Lucas's eyes, wide, unsure, silently pleading. I stepped aside. They walked into my home like they belonged there, glancing around and nodding like they were proud of me. My dad walked straight to the kitchen and opened the fridge without asking. My mom sat down on the couch inside, like she was finally relaxing after a long day. Lucas hovered near the doorway, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets, eyes flicking nervously between me and our parents. It didn't take long for them to get to the point. "We've hit some hard times," my dad said, clearing his throat. "Lost the house. Money's tight. We just need somewhere to stay for a while, just until we get back on our feet." I stared at him, at my mother, at Lucas. After all these years, after everything, now they want help from me? But then Lucas looked at me again, his face pale and tight with tension, and I felt my chest ache. I agreed. 2 weeks. That's what I told them. 2 weeks, and then they had to go. But deep down, I already knew. This wasn't going to end well. For the first few days, I tried to convince myself this arrangement might actually work. My parents stayed in the guest room, a small space I'd barely finished painting 2 months ago, and Lucas took the couch in the living room. I set boundaries from the start, 2 weeks. No exceptions. But boundaries only work when everyone respects them, and my family, well, they've never been great at that. At first, it was the little things. My dad leaving his dirty coffee mug on the kitchen counter every morning, even though the sink was right there. My mom rearranging the pantry because it makes more sense this way. Aunt Karen wasn't here physically, but her passive-aggressive texts kept arriving, dripping with fake concern. "Hope you're not too overwhelmed having everyone there. Family is a lot of work, huh?" But Lucas was different. He was quiet, careful not to take up too much space. Every morning, he'd fold up the blanket he slept with and tuck the couch pillows back neatly. He'd offer to help with dishes, with yard work, with anything he thought might lighten the load. One night, about a week in, I found him sitting on the back porch with his hoodie pulled up, knees drawn to his chest. I stepped out and sat beside him. "Everything okay?" I asked. He shrugged, staring out at the overgrown yard. "They're fighting again." I sighed. I'd been hearing it too, muffled arguments seeping through the thin walls of the guest room. "Is that normal for them now?" I asked hesitantly. Lucas gave a humorless laugh. "Yeah, pretty much every day. Sometimes over money, sometimes over nothing at all. Dad's angry all the time now. Mom just cries, and then Aunt Karen stirs it all up again." We sat in silence for a while, the chill of the night air settling around us. "You know," Lucas said quietly, "they told me you ran away, that you left because you didn't want to deal with them anymore." My stomach tightened. "That's not what happened," I said softly. "I know," he replied. "I figured it out eventually. Aunt Karen let it slip during one of her wine rants last year." I clenched my jaw, trying to swallow down the anger rising in my chest. They lied to him, made me the villain. And Lucas, this quiet kid who deserved so much better, had been caught in the middle of it. "You don't have to stay with them, Lucas," I said. "When the 2 weeks are up, you can stay here. You don't have to go back." He hesitated, looking down at his hands. I don't know if I can do that. I mean, they're still my parents, you know? I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. But things didn't get better. They got worse. On the 10th day, I came home from work to find my dad sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of my mail spread out in front of him. Bills, bank statements, stuff he had no business looking at. What the hell are you doing? I snapped, dropping my keys onto the counter. Relax, he said, leaning back in the chair. Just making sure you're staying on top of things. Wouldn't want you to lose the house, after all. I felt something inside me snap. You don't get to act like you care about whether I lose this house or not. You threw me out. You. And now you're sitting here, going through my mail, drinking my coffee, and acting like you have some sort of authority over me. My dad's face darkened. He was never the kind of man who took well to being challenged, and I could see the anger simmering just beneath his surface. Don't raise your voice at me, Ryan, he said, his tone low and dangerous. But I wasn't 16 anymore. I wasn't some scared kid waiting for his approval or terrified of his temper. This is my house, I said firmly. You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't get to treat me like a child in my own home. My mom appeared in the doorway then, wringing her hands in that nervous way she always did when conflict bubbled up. Please, both of you, she said softly. Let's not fight. Ryan, your father didn't mean anything by it. He's just trying to help. Help. I laughed bitterly. Help looks a lot different than going through someone's private mail and criticizing everything they've worked for. My dad pushed back from the table and stood up, towering over me. You know what? Maybe we should leave. Maybe we're wasting our time trying to fix things with you. Maybe you should, I said coldly. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Ryan, please. Don't say that. But I was done. I was so goddamn tired of feeling like I had to tiptoe around them in my own home. 2 weeks, I said, my voice shaking slightly. That's what we agreed on. And you've got 4 days left. After that, I want you out. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them standing there in silence. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the ceiling. I could hear faint murmurs from the guest room, my mother's voice trembling as she tried to calm my father down. Part of me felt guilty, like I'd failed some unspoken duty as their son. But another part of me, a bigger part, felt angry. Angry at their entitlement, angry at their lack of accountability, angry that after everything, they still couldn't see me as anything other than the rebellious teenager they'd kicked out years ago. The next morning, Lucas knocked softly on my bedroom door. Can I come in? He asked. Yeah, of course. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. His hoodie was pulled low over his face, but I could still see the worry in his eyes. They're not going to leave, Ryan, he said quietly. They're already talking about how they can convince you to let them stay longer. Aunt Karen's supposed to come next week, and Mom said something about asking you to let her move in too. My stomach turned. Aunt Karen? In my house? No, absolutely not. I don't know what to do, Lucas, I admitted. I can't let them stay, but kicking them out feels, I don't know, wrong, I guess. He sat down on the edge of my bed. You've done more for them than they ever did for you. Don't let them guilt you into thinking otherwise. Lucas was only 16, but in that moment, he sounded so much older, like he'd been carrying the weight of our family on his shoulders for far too long. Lucas, when they leave, you can stay here. You don't have to go with them. He didn't respond right away. He just stared down at his hands, his fingers twisting nervously in the hem of his hoodie. I want to stay, he said softly, but I'm scared of what'll happen if I do. Mom's going to cry. Dad's going to get mad. And Aunt Karen, he trailed off, shaking his head. You're not responsible for their feelings, I said gently. You deserve to be safe, to be happy. He nodded, but I could tell the weight of the decision was crushing him. The next few days were tense. My dad barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was short and clipped. My mom floated around the house like a ghost, eyes red and puffy from crying. Lucas stayed in the guest room most of the time, his headphones on and his phone lighting up with missed calls from our parents whenever they left the house. On the final night of their stay, my dad decided to confront me. It was late, close to midnight. I was in the living room, scrolling on my phone, when he walked in and sat down across from me. "We've decided we're not leaving," he said flatly. I looked up at him, my stomach dropping. "That's not your decision to make. We don't have anywhere else to go, Ryan. And you have this whole house to yourself. Don't you think it's selfish to let us struggle when you could help us?" The audacity of it all made me want to scream. "No," I said firmly. "You had your chance. You had years to make things right with me, and you threw me away like I was nothing. Now you want me to save you? You don't get to do that." His face twisted into a sneer. "You think you're better than us now? Because you own a shitty little house and work 2 minimum wage jobs? You think that makes you a man?" I stood up, my hands trembling with anger. "Get out. Get out of my house, and don't come back." My mom appeared in the doorway then, her face streaked with tears. "Please, Ryan. Please don't do this." Lucas appeared behind her, his eyes wide and fearful. But I didn't back down. "You have to leave," I said, my voice low but steady. "All of you. Now." My dad stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a second, I thought he might hit me, but instead, he turned and stormed out the front door. My mom hesitated, staring at me like she wanted to say something, but then she followed him. Lucas stayed frozen in the hallway, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Are you going with them?" I asked softly. He shook his head. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't do it anymore." I walked over to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and nodded. "You don't have to." The door slammed behind my parents, and the house fell silent. Lucas and I stood there in the dim light of the hallway, the weight of everything hanging heavy between us. But for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. The night after my parents left felt suffocatingly quiet. Lucas and I sat in the living room, neither of us saying much. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on us, thick and unmoving. I could still hear the echo of the door slamming behind them, still see the hurt in my mom's eyes and the anger etched across my dad's face. Lucas was curled up on the far end of the couch, clutching his phone in both hands like it might anchor him to something solid. His backpack sat on the floor beside him, still zipped up tight, as if he wasn't sure whether he was really allowed to stay. "You don't have to sleep on the couch, you know," I said quietly. "You can take the guest room." He hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," I nodded. "It's yours now." He gave me a small, hesitant smile and stood up, dragging his backpack behind him as he disappeared into the hallway. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the blank TV screen, trying to process everything. When I finally went to bed, sleep didn't come easy. My head was loud with thoughts, old memories, new regrets, and the bitter taste of guilt. I knew I'd made the right choice by telling them to leave, but that didn't make it feel any less awful. Over the next few weeks, Lucas slowly started to settle in. At first, he tiptoed around like a guest overstaying his welcome. He'd quietly ask permission to use the shower, to eat food from the fridge, to sit on the couch while I worked at the dining table. But little by little, the tension started to fade. I helped him enroll in the local high school. The school counselor asked for an emergency contact, and when Lucas looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes, I said, "Put me down." I'll never forget the look on his face, like he couldn't believe someone would actually choose to be responsible for him. The first time I heard him laugh, like really laugh, was on a Saturday morning when we were both trying to fix the crooked cabinet door in the kitchen. I'd been holding the screwdriver all wrong, swearing under my breath, when the whole thing popped off and nearly hit me in the face. Lucas burst out laughing, loud, unguarded, and real. It was the best sound I'd heard in years. But healing isn't linear. Some nights, I'd hear him crying softly in the guest room. Other times, he'd flinch when he heard someone shouting on TV. He didn't talk much about our parents, and I didn't push him. One evening, as we sat eating dinner together, mac and cheese with frozen chicken nuggets, because I was still no gourmet chef, he broke the silence. "Do you ever think about them?" he asked. I set down my fork. "Yeah, all the time." "Do you think they regret it? What they did to you? To us?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "I don't know, Lucas. I'd like to think they do, but I'm not sure they even understand what they did wrong." He nodded, poking at his food with his fork. I think Mom does, he said softly. I think she regrets it. But Dad, he trailed off, shaking his head. We didn't talk about it again that night, but the conversation lingered in the air for days afterward. A few months later, Lucas came home from school clutching a stack of college brochures. I don't even know if I want to go, he said, dropping them onto the kitchen table. It's expensive, and I don't even know what I'd study. I sat down across from him. You've got time to figure it out. And if you want to go, we'll find a way to make it work. We? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, we. He smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. Life settled into something that felt almost normal after that. I worked my shifts at the diner and gas station. Lucas went to school, and in the evenings, we'd sit on the couch watching bad action movies or playing old video games I'd picked up from a thrift store. Sometimes, though, the past would still come knocking. My mom called a few times. I never answered, but Lucas did once. I walked in on him sitting on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and shaky. When he hung up, he looked at me and said, "She wants me to come home. Are you going to?" I asked carefully. He shook his head. No. She said Dad's been drinking a lot, and Aunt Karen moved in. It's worse than before. I sat down next to him. You don't owe them anything, Lucas. Not your time, not your forgiveness, not your silence. He nodded, but I could tell it still hurt. A year passed. Lucas graduated high school and I was there, sitting in the audience with my phone out, taking blurry pictures and trying not to cheer too loudly when his name was called. Afterward, we went out for burgers, and he told me he decided to enroll in community college. Close enough to stay here, if that's okay, he said. It's more than okay, Lucas, I replied. One night, a few weeks later, we sat on the porch watching the sun set. The sky was painted in soft oranges and purples, and everything felt quiet in that perfect way it sometimes does at dusk. You know, Lucas said, staring out at the horizon, you saved my life. I shook my head. No, man. You saved your own life. You walked away. You made the choice. Yeah, but I wouldn't have had anywhere to go if it weren't for you. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sat there beside him, letting the quiet fill the space between us. We don't hear from our parents anymore. Not really. Every now and then, I'll get a missed call from my mom, or Lucas will get a vague text from Aunt Karen about family loyalty. But they've mostly faded into the background now, ghosts of a life we both walked away from. But here's the thing. Family isn't about blood. It's not about obligation or guilt, or who shares your last name. It's about showing up. It's about being there for someone when they have nowhere else to go. Lucas is my family. And no matter where life takes us from here, I know one thing for sure. Neither of us is ever going to feel alone like that again.